Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's XTalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Using Technology to Reduce Monitoring Costs and Increase Quality. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your XTalks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers during the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. I'd also like to welcome our attendees viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, and I encourage them to submit their questions as well via the comments tab. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank CREO, who developed the content for this presentation. CREO is an e-clinical solution provider delivering innovative data capture technology for sites, sponsors, and CROs. As the industry's leading eSource provider, CREO's unique architecture enables a single point of data capture that embeds quality and transparency at the point of entry and creates significant downstream efficiencies. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. With over 15 years of clinical research experience working at the site, CRO, and sponsor level, Robert Goldman offers a unique blend of in-depth therapeutic and medical knowledge with extensive experience across dozens of therapeutic areas. His expertise spans a 360-degree view of clinical studies and trial operations, providing a comprehensive understanding that ensures the successful execution and completion of all phases of global clinical programs. And prior to co-founding CREO, Raymond Nomizu owned and operated a clinical research site. He has over 10 years of management consulting experience, including at the Boston Consulting Group. He also started BenchCore, a real estate data analytics company that was acquired by RefineRE. He began his career as an attorney and has JD and BA degrees from Harvard University. But now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our first speaker, Raymond Nomizu. You may begin when you're ready.
All right, thank you, Ryan. So we'll start off with a little bit of context setting. I don't think, we need to belabor the points that are on this page. I think these are pretty well-known trends. I'll just speak a little bit on the site side since I used to run a research site and our system has a lot of site users. But the protocols are getting more and more complicated every year. It's no secret the eligibility criteria is increasing, the endpoints are increasing, and the number and range of technologies that are deployed on a trial chosen by the sponsor and given to the sites is also expanding. So it's leading to incredible complexity at the site level, and that complexity leads to burnout, leads to churn, leads to shortages, leads to a lot of issues with the sites really struggling to keep up with the demands of running multiple clinical trials. And any research site's going to have to run at least 10 simultaneously to have a viable business doing this. So I think these are really pretty well documented. One of my big learnings with talking to Robert, you've had a lot of experience, Robert, is on the CRO side of things, and you've seen things on the other side as a CRA, but why don't you tell the audience a bit about what you've seen on the CRA side in terms of what this complexity does?
Yeah, thanks so much, Raymond. I appreciate it. And I think the audience will appreciate, whether you're a site stakeholder, a sponsor stakeholder, a CRO stakeholder, what we encounter in terms of having to endure travel, the inefficiencies of being assigned to multiple protocols, having to kind of navigate different personalities and paradigms within the site, and their infrastructures and their processes, because at the end of the day, sites are independent contractors who are tasked with performing work, and they are businesses. They're certainly not 501c3 charities. So sponsors are tasked with providing a fair budget based with fair market value to enable them to, not only operate, but operate with a substantial, not a substantial, but a reasonable overhead expenditure, enabling them to have a viable business model. To Raymond's point, what we're seeing is just overhead percentages increasing as high as 40–45%. That is not atypical in these days. And as a result, CROs are operating in a very inefficient manner. And as a result of that, those pass-through costs are now being, passed on to the sponsor. And quite honestly, I think sponsors will agree, whether you're large pharma, mid-size, or even small, publicly traded, privately held. We do not have printing presses, and these efficiencies and differentiators need to start to stand out in order for efficiencies to be realized by CROs, by sponsors, ultimately by sites. So right now, I believe what Creo is offering and what our topic is going to discuss here is how we can make things more efficient, and all stakeholders working towards a common goal will benefit by these efficiencies. Mainly CROs are able to define themselves by being differentiators in terms of their offerings to their clients. There's no shortage of CROs today that have niche offerings that are trying to be competitive in the effort of winning business. And sponsors are risk averse by nature. I'm not talking, nobody wants to lose a $200 or $300 million portfolio that's been under development for 10 to 15 years. And so they're risk averse in that situation. And then sites are always wanting to do the best job possible, but resources are lean on both sides of the equation. So how do we operationalize and realize these efficiencies in terms of making everybody's lives day to day, operationally and executionally better? And we intend to show the audience today how Creo can enable not only CROs being differentiators in terms of offerings, but passing those savings on to their sponsor clients, and at the same time creating a better and ease of burden to our sites who are at the front lines, who are arguably the most important part of this equation. And with that, I think we can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, fantastic. Robert, you've done a really good job. Even though you're not employed at Creo, you've seen Creo in your in your career, and you've done a very good job articulating the Creo value proposition and the delivery model. But why don't you walk the audience through, like, what is a
Sure.
current operating model on the left, and what's the potential new model on the right?
Absolutely. So to your point, Raymond, I have had the pleasure of, running multiple global studies, where, again, prior to being involved with Creo in this endeavor here, for the purpose of this webinar, 50 to 60% of our sites on any global trial were Creo users to begin with. So I think that's important to note. But I think the audience is very familiar with the current operating model, so I'm certainly not here to read any slides to you. But obviously, everybody knows the industry has shied away within the last decade, for sure, for providing source templates, right? There's that liability portion for the sponsor, for the CRO. Heaven forbid someone misses something, the finger pointing starts happening, and this is not an efficient way of working together, right? Um, as a sponsor representative, I love to have this one team mentality, and I believe sites and CROs kind of feel the same way. Whereas we expect our CRO partners, or I expect CRO partners, to be an extension of our company. So with that said, the site produces their source based on the annotated CRFs that are put out. And, it's that labor intensive, inefficient way, having to pay attention to version control. And you really kind of don't know what you need to collect. You're trying to follow your site processes. You're trying to encounter and encompass what's on the CRF, on your source documents. And then at the end of the day, you're conducting this visit, and your coordinator, who are, again, big respect for our coordinators. They're the most underrepresented people in our industry and the most important, in my opinion. So I have a tremendous respect for them and would like to take this opportunity to thank them for everything they do on a day-to-day basis. I am here today actually to advocate on their behalf, because I don't think there's a single coordinator who would disagree with the fact that when they're tasked with developing worksheets with a new study, and or an amendment comes out and they have to update the source and they have to worry about version control, then the monitor comes in and then they kind of say, well, this isn't accurate, you're missing this critical variable, you're missing this data point. And there's just this real inefficient circular door kicking the can down the road until you get some source, and now you have the monitors show up on site, and they're there to look at your source data, and they're going to compare that against what you have in your EDC. SDR, SDV, just to be clear, source data review, as source data verification, are two very different things. And I think a lot of people are now understanding that, this notion of 100% SDR requiring to look at all the source to make sure Alcoa principles are followed, not only at the source level, but the study level, the site level, and all levels, quite frankly, even as it pertains to the TMF. CRAs are looking at this stuff, right? They're reading all the source, they're getting to know the patient, they're looking at the chart. Then they should be going into the EDC and reviewing to ensure that there's consistency, accuracy, originality, all the Alcoa principles apply to the EDC system. That's very, very inefficient. So what CREO has now developed, which I believe will be the future of clinical research, and it's already demonstrating to be the case, where we have this what we call DDC model, this direct data capture model, where the easiest way to think of this is your eSource template or your source paper template is now your CRF. There's really no reason to have a source document piece of paper that captures an exorbitant amount of information that is not necessarily needed or captured by your EDC. And then you have that duplicate effort. So the CRC is writing this, filling out this source document piece of paper. Then they have to go at the end of the visit back to their desk, sit down, and now transcribe what they wrote on paper into some electronic data capture system, whichever one is your favorite, it's fine. But imagine a world where now the CRF is your source. And that's precisely what we propose here today, that CREO is used not only for your eSource, but also your EDC. It's one study build, it's one in the same. So when you're filling out the CRF, that is your source. And there's a lot of features that we're going to go through that enables and empowers coordinators to reduce protocol deviations, reduce transcriptional errors, increase quality by design, as opposed to being reactive. We're now going to be proactive. And when we start to realize that the CRF itself is now the source document itself, all electronic, monitoring paradigm has now completely changed. There is no need for monitors to go on site as frequently as they go. Sponsors and CROs have real-time access to the study visit as it's happening in real time. So data can now be reviewed remotely. It can be reviewed contemporaneously. It could even be reviewed much, much sooner than we would expect to wait for a site to say, okay, we know you finished a visit. Now you have to go in and transcribe all this data into the EDC. And really, as a sponsor / CRO representative, we are at the mercy of the sites, having to chase them down, open a field, enter data. Why did this patient screen fail? Whatever your motive is for understanding or needing to see what's in the EDC, there's inherently a delay. I think everybody can agree with that. CREO eliminates all of these barriers and roadblocks to having real-time decision-making ability via this DDC model. So we intend to kind of show and demonstrate not only the efficiencies around cost savings, but all of the value propositions that sponsors, CROs, and sites achieve and realize by the use of this next generation direct data capture eSource EDC model.
Sorry, just to jump in here, the key, I think a couple key points I want to emphasize is there's only one build, as Robert said. So the eSource and eCRF is one build. So this is not a paradigm where source is one system and you build, EDC is another system and you build, and then you have to map it, right? That's actually 3 steps: build, map. Now it's just 1 step, build. And you can build the source template, that basically guides the site through the workflow. So you have one centralized team that can do a comprehensive and thorough source build that basically ensures protocol compliance, as opposed to the current process where you've got, if you have 20 sites in the trial, you got 20 different people looking at the same protocol, interpreting it slightly different, writing the worksheets in completely different ways. Some of them are going to write the wrong way. Some of them are going to have protocol deviations. It's guaranteed, in fact, right now in the current model, that there will be protocol deviations, if for no other reason than the fact that there isn't any type of standardized worksheet given to the sites, and they're left with their own interpretation. So you've got overworked coordinators having to build their own source template I mean, it's going to be all over the place in terms of quality and consistency across sites. So I think that's a really critical point to make. And then when you're collecting data electronically, all the edit checks fire in real time while the patient is there. So in our system, the sites, the coordinators can, if they put the wrong value or some type of value triggers a warning, the warning shows up in real time. And the coordinator said, oh, and gives an opportunity to say, oh, did I make a mistake? Did I hit the wrong button, or is this the right response? And so now the coordinator is getting that feedback in real time. And if the coordinator says, nope, this is the right value, I'm going to go ahead and hit save and submit the data, that query then becomes the auto query, right? So you're not generating auto queries 2 weeks later when they go into the EDC and enter the visit and the patient's already gone, right? It's there in real time. So it really brings down the deviations and improves the quality and reduces queries.
Yeah, and one more point of clarification to Raymond's point is that imagine you're a coordinator and you're typing in a value that in the back of the scenes in a typical model, when you hit save, now you see this edit check auto system query that's populated. That query is now captured in the audit trail. It's there forever. What Creo enables you to do is as you're typing in a value, it says, are you sure, before you hit that save, and it gives you an opportunity to correct that, which inherently will decrease the query, content and quantity as a result. So that kind of reminder, are you sure, is not a query until you hit save. So if you choose to ignore that auto system reminder, are you sure, and you hit save, then it becomes a query as part of the audit trail. But the beauty of this is that, to Raymond's point, it has so many built-in side features in the background as you're completing the source, aka the CRF, which is a single study build. You are able to reduce protocol deviations as a result of transcriptional errors, and or if you have to have a patient supine 5 minutes prior to taking vitals or whatever, right? We have all these things that are pretty consistent in protocols. The system is not only reminding you, but if you try to enter it too soon, it's giving you that reminder in real time. So again, reduction in queries, reduction in the follow-up of queries, reduction in protocol deviations are all built by design via a one study build. So that's very important to kind of articulate. I think we could move on to the next slide.
Yeah, so we've touched upon this in the earlier slide, but I'll just go through this real quick, and then I think, Rob, I really want to hone in on a couple things on the left. But right now, site captures data on source, could be paper, could be Creo. Site enters the data into the EDC. The monitor, the CRA, does the source data review and the source data verification, as Robert said, and then data management will go in and review the data in the EDC and interrogate that data and issue manual queries and close and confirm the data. We can eliminate 5 steps and make it 2 steps. The site collects data, I'll collect it once, and then it gets reviewed, period. There's one review queue. So I really want to hone in on what's going on with those 3 review queues in the over on the left-hand side. Robert, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't know if you, Robert, did you lose my, Ryan, is my audio lost?
I can hear you, Raymond. I'm not sure why we seem to have perhaps lost Robert.
Yeah, Robert, I think we lost you. So while Robert is...
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I want to hone in on that.
All right, great.
I really want to hone in on that last, the review queue there at the bottom there. You're actually having 2 different people review essentially the same data set. The CRAs are reviewing the data in the source, and then the data management's reviewing the same data set in a different system, the EDC system. It's almost like you have 2 different people reviewing 2 different spreadsheets with the same data, and the step in the middle is to make sure the spreadsheets align. I mean, that is inherently inefficient here. And some of the pushback we get, or some of the concerns we get when we talk about this model is from, quite honestly, the data management team. And some of the concerns that we get would be things like in source, sites will write progress notes, which are basically free text entries by the site to explain or amplify, clinical judgments and findings. And a lot of times data management doesn't want the progress notes. But Robert, what I'm talking about with the progress notes, right? These are, like, from your perspective as a CRA, how would you characterize the role of progress notes in terms of reviewing the integrity of the data?
Yeah, so I mean, they're critical in terms of a CRA because what we see in the progress notes are we see a lot of different things that could be potential missed adverse events, missed updates to medical history, additional con meds, changes to con meds. So there's a lot of context in those progress notes which potentially could get lost. And so it's critical that we have an ability to review those. And, with the CREO model, that enables you to kind of embed a progress note within that certain visit, which allows the CRA to now kind of look at those items that I just mentioned. And it also gives real-time review to the person who's reviewing using the reviewer module, which we will talk about here shortly. I hope that answers the question there, Raymond,
Yeah,
in terms of progress
absolutely.
notes.
And so CRAs are largely, clinically trained, and so you have people that are clinically trained reviewing essentially clinical data and being able to interpret and interrogate the data for accuracy and consistency. But I've had data management folks tell me we can't have progress notes, and I say why? Well, what if there's something in there that sort of, it contradicts the structured data? And my reaction, well, that's your job, is to query it, right? But I think, let's be honest, a lot of the data management folks who are hired to do this position aren't necessarily clinically trained. So they don't know how to interpret progress notes. They don't, so it's data they don't know what to do with. And so what essentially, when people say, oh, I don't want data management to see all of the data, I want them to see only structured data and no unstructured notes. What you're really, when someone says that, what I'm hearing is, I want you to dumb down the data and reduce the transparency to match the skill set of the person assigned to review the data. And I would actually challenge the industry to say, no, the person reviewing and interrogating the data should be appropriately skilled to review the data. That'd be like if I were on the peer review committee for a physics paper, I said, hey, I don't understand calculus, so do me a favor and don't show me any formulas, but I'll go ahead and review and approve it publication. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So let's be real here. We're here to do research. We're not here to create redundant jobs. So there should be one review queue. It should be someone who's clinically trained who can really review and interrogate the data in totality. And that's going to lead to a much better data quality process.
Right.
So with that, we can move to the next slide.
Yeah.
So I'll preface this by saying we get asked this question all the time, which is, has CREO ever been used? Has this model ever been used in a drug that subsequently got approved by the FDA? Before I answer that question, I want to actually show the audience how data actually flows. So this is a data flow view of the model. So over there on the left, you have source, and then you have EDC, and they're disconnected. They're separate, right? So source and EDC can diverge. And then the EDC at the end of the trial is locked and exported. That export is a file. That file is then given to the statistician along with presumably files from the ePro and lab and all the other data sources, aggregated, converted into, I believe it's called ADAM STTM data sets, and all kinds of analytics are run, and that all goes into the IND. So it's really important to realize that the EDC is actually a pit stop. At the end of the day, the FDA is not interacting with the EDC. The EDC just, the data is pulled out as a file. That's really important because if you look on the right-hand side, the DDC model, look at the data flow, straight from source to EDC to export, okay? They both end up in the same place, which is a file given to the biostatistician for conversion analysis. But the one on the right has a straight data chain through it, right? So I guess going back to the question of has CREO ever been used in a drug that's been approved, I guess I'm going to draw an analogy here, but like, Robert, you're a football fan, right? So you know this.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. But like, let's just say, a football team is going to the Super Bowl, right? Like, I'm assuming they're not flying on American or Delta, like at Logan Airport, right? Assume they get their own chartered plane. So, and now imagine if I have a chartered plane business and I submit a bid and I say, hey, I want to be a chartered service so I can bring your football team over to the Super Bowl. I would expect you to ask me questions about cost, quality, timeliness, track record, all that stuff. But then if you turn around and ask me, hey, have you ever transported a team that went on to win the Super Bowl? I'd be like, I don't know. That's got nothing to do with me. That's got everything to do with whether your athletes are good or not, your coach and all that stuff. Nothing to do with me, right? I'm just getting you there, right? So what is the essence of how the FDA decides whether to approve a drug or not? It's whether the drug works or not. It's the efficacy and it's the safety. They're reviewing the analysis. They're not going to sit there and be influenced by how the data got there. That doesn't make any sense. Like, why would the fact that the data passed through this vendor versus that vendor on its way over to some massive consolidated transformed data set that the FDA is analyzing off, that is completely irrelevant to whether or not the drug is approved. Am I missing anything, Robert?
No, you're absolutely spot on. I mean, the repository in which the data is housed and exported for the sake of analysis is irrelevant. And quite frankly, anybody who challenges that, the audit trails, the queries, the updates, the reason for change, it's all captured in the CREO DDC model. So there's nothing you're losing, you're only gaining. But I do find it fascinating for the folks who, always ask that question, well, has this been used to get a drug across the finish line? And to Raymond's point, that has everything to do with the safety profile and efficacy and your endpoints and your protocol and study designs. It has nothing to do with which vendor you choose. And that should be proven in yourself. I mean, just look at how many EDC vendors exist today. There's hundreds of them. So if it mattered, why wouldn't there just be an industry standard, right? So really we need to think a little bit smarter. We need to work a little bit better. And of course, this enables us to do things a lot faster and more efficient with tremendous cost savings. So keep that in your back pocket. I think it's really important to not worry about things like that because, again, to Raymond's analogy, it's irrelevant if the airplane has flown a Super Bowl winning team or not. The fact is, can they accommodate these people? Do they provide the services that this team expects? And can they get there safely and on time? That's what matters in the context of Raymond's analogy. And it's no different here in terms of everybody, all stakeholders working towards a common goal of a successful outcome, and that's getting an approved NDA. So the repository in which the data sits is irrelevant. The FDA, any auditors would have access forever, just as they would with paper. And again, it does not matter for the sake of whether or not your drug works, solely relies on your data itself. So great analogy, Raymond. I love that airplane analogy.
Thank you. And of course, we're assuming 21 CFR 11 compliance, of course. But
always. All right, so I think we can go to the next slide.
Okay, so we did some cost modeling to see if we can quantify potential cost savings from using this model. And so just a few caveats, but we're looking at monitoring and data management costs. There are, of course, other costs involved in a trial that we're not attempting to quantify. And in looking at these, we looked at prevailing market rates from CROs. And we recognize there are sponsors that might do this in-house. They might not be fully in-sourced. It might be a mixed model. But at the end of the day, even if you're doing this in-house as a sponsor, you're still spending resources, you're still allocating time and money. So the core insights are still the same. So I think whatever insights you get from this, they are, they hold regardless of whether you're using a full service, an FSP or in-house model. So with that caveat, let's see if anything else to add, Robert. We can go to the next slide.
No, I have nothing to add.
Okay. Yeah, why don't you talk, Robert, about some of the cost benchmarking that you and Justin at Alcoa did?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I'd like to give a good, a kind of shout out to Justin Rudolph. And what we did was we took a standardized version of cost modeling and we normalized it across many different variables, across many different CROs, dozens and dozens and dozens of different data points that we went into this to kind of come to an average cost per driver that most sponsors and CROs would be looking at, which is represented here in this slide. Raymond, if I could hand it back to you just for a second, I do need to go grab a charger. I apologize, just one second.
Ryan, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we basically ran a model and came up with some simple study parameters over there on the left. So we assumed 20 sites, 28 months duration. That includes the enrollment period, which could be a year. So it doesn't necessarily mean treatment period, but say 28 months from start to finish. I think in our world that would be defined as, I believe it was study start all the way through database lock. 300 subjects, 10 visits of subjects, 30 unique CRFs. And then based on that, we would estimate how many actual CRFs are there going to be. Probably about 45,000. There's some math behind that. It's a reasonable range. But those drivers on the left are essentially the parameters that most CRO sponsors are going to use to estimate the volume of work that's required to support that trial. Those are the critical variables that are used. So what we did is we took those variables and then we put them through a current model and the CREO model, and you can compare the costs side by side. So you can see where there are cost savings. And between monitoring and data management, we came up with 33% savings. And I think that the estimate's fairly conservative. We'll go into exactly how we did that. But at a high level, we included no cost savings on some items. For instance, central monitoring, we assumed 0 cost savings. Probably, I think there is some, but real quick, Robert, for everyone's benefit, just what is the difference between central monitoring and site monitoring?
Sure. So, site monitoring obviously is things that we can't detect centrally, right? So things that we really need to go on site and look at are what we have to do. So central monitors, typically are tasked with looking at things that can be centrally detected based on a risk analysis. So what we did here was we took a scenario. This may not be, applicable to everybody on the call, and if not, that's fine. We're happy to, kind of model something for you to represent a cost. So, yeah, hand it back to you for a sec, Raymond.
Yeah. All right, so you can go to the next page, Ryan. So we'll deep dive on each of these monitoring and data management categories in a second. So this is the site monitoring cost savings build. And so what we do is we start with a number of CRFs that need to be reviewed over the course of a study, which is, I think, pretty much agreed to as the unit of work. And then we have this concept of, okay, so a monitor spends a day on site or a day looking at a site's CRFs. How many CRFs can a monitor process in a day? So a typical ratio outside of oncology might be 100 to 120. With the CREO model, there is no looking at an EDC to confirm the data matches, right? So that entire process goes away. Also, we've heard from CRAs say it's also easier and faster because it's cleaner. There's no legibility issues. It's standardized presentation. So there's some other efficiencies there. So we modeled a 50% increase in productivity. So, which again, I think is fairly conservative, but basically monitors ought to be able to review more in a given day than they can in the current model. So that means there's fewer monitor days, and every monitor day is, a unit of work. But not only that, but the monitoring can be done either on-site or remote. And we're not going to be black and white and assume it goes from 100% on-site to 100% remote. We assumed 80% on-site, 20% remote to recognize that remote is, on a lot of trials. But with the CREO model, a lot of it can move to remote. So we're still going to assume some on-site monitoring. And by the way, this is just the interim monitoring visits. We didn't touch the SIVs or the COVs. So we assume the SIVs and the COVs are on site. Those stayed the same. So you still got the closeout visits to do the IP, reconciliation. So this is the interim data monitoring visits. We're still allocating 30% to be on site, just to build in the opportunities for monitors to go and meet the PI or do, whatever, like IP accountability mid-study. And then what happens is we can actually calculate the cost impact. So the two savings are less monitoring overall, which is fewer monitoring days, and more of the monitoring is done remotely, and remote monitoring is a lower cost. There's no travel, and the fee structure associated with it is actually usually lower because you don't have to build in the time in between visits to travel. So you can actually have, because I think there's this, I believe, Robert, there's this notion of 4 hours there, 4 hours back, right? That has to be built in, right, to accommodate travel.
Yeah, it's usually like a 20 to 22 hour bucket where we, CRAs have a 2-hour window for prep and for the visit, 4 hours for travel, 8 hours on site, and then 4 hours of follow up writing your trip report. So it's usually broken down into a 20-hour bucket. I do want to highlight here the monitoring days. So, somebody might assume, well, there's less monitoring days, and that means there's less touch points in terms of what we're doing. The reason there's less monitoring days is because your efficiencies have exponentially increased. And as a result of the CREO DDC model, you can kind of benefit CROs can keep their more senior principal staff, actually at home in their office, and they can review multiple protocols, multiple sites in a single day, because they're not wasting time sitting on an airplane. They're not wasting time in airports as a result of delays back and forth from, taxis and all the other things that go along with traveling. So because of the efficiency, you have less monitoring days, but actually you have more touch points. So that's really an important part here to kind of realize. Also, giving your CRAs the time to become the experts they need to be when they start to interact with the data and validate what we're actually putting into the database to ensure that it meets the Alcoa standards, to make sure that we're protecting the welfare rights and safety of our patients and participants. That's the core value of what monitoring needs to be. It's not going in to look at source and making sure the source matches the EDC and not taking note of whether or not there's safety or efficacy trends that we're completely missing. So enabling quality of life for our monitors and enabling sites to not have to prepare for these on-site monitoring visits in a sense of having to accommodate and be available all day for the monitor, or at least carve out an hour in the morning, carve out an hour before I leave, and let's work through these action items and updates to the source and updates to the queries, and then you have all these action items. CRAs know exactly what I'm talking about, same with the CRCs. You kind of eliminate all of that inefficient behavior that kind of reduces the quality of why we're there in the first place. This enables more junior staff to go do those on-site visits. So really the essence of what do we need to do that's on-site and on-site only? Well, that's IP accountability, right? We can't count pills, we can't reconcile vials, we can't look at injections, whatever the form of the IP may be, even to a degree devices, that is still going to require some sort of on-site presence. And I do want to also mention that this industry standard of, oh, we always do the first monitoring visit within 2 weeks, and we put that flexibility in the clinical monitoring plan to say that we have to do this first visit within 2 weeks of the first patient being randomized. Well, what if in this model, we could even do a visit when the patient's screened? We could look at medical records. We can look at concomitant medications. We can do an eligibility check even before we get to the point of a potential patient who's randomized and who's ineligible. Now that impacts everything. Now that patient has a decision, or the CRO and sponsor have a decision to make. And that's whether or not they want to retain the patient for safety data and safety data only. That patient, because they did not meet eligibility, A, is very bad. That's an important PD. And that has to be ultimately reported to the IRB typically. And of course, that patient's efficacy data cannot be used as it pertains to the analysis. So with Creo's DDC model, there's so many upside benefits to not only just performing a quality check prior to the randomization, but you don't have to wait that 2 weeks anymore after that patient's randomized, because sites are always encouraged, let's go, run, we need to enroll. I've gotten to sites before where they've enrolled 5-6 patients before I could actually get to the site, which still was in line with their first patient being enrolled, and they made the same mistakes across all 6 patients. So now we have a multitude of problems that could have been avoided if we were aware of them much sooner. So there's a lot of different values, and we don't want to just hone in on, well, there's less monitoring and we're not going on site. I would love to hear from the audience above and beyond really IP accountability. What other reasons do you need to be there on site? Obviously PI interaction is important, but that can be done via phone. It can be done via Zoom. It can even be done via other, validated 21 CFR Part 11 compliant platforms where communications between CRA and PIs can occur. So, again, I think reducing those pass-through fees as it pertains to the total overall clinical operational budget is a significant savings, and all the upsides that go along with being able to contemporaneously review data as it happens at the time points that the CRO and sponsor collaboratively come up together with is just a win-win for all. So it benefits the sites, it benefits the CRA, it benefits the sponsor, and it benefits the CRO in the fact that, listen, if I'm a CRA and I'm assigned to 2-3 protocols and I don't have to travel and I can look at multiple sites from the ease of my office, and have a more junior CRA potentially go on site and collaborate with him or her doing IP reconciliation in real time, giving that CRA exposure to on-site interaction instead of this shadow visit that we notoriously do, that's an efficiency. That's a retention model too. Not only do the CRC's lives improve, but the CRA's lives improve. Burnout is a real thing that we have to address. And I'm not saying that Creo is the savior to this, but it certainly helps. And it really articulates the fact that we're working in inefficient ways and we can produce efficiencies by using this particular model, and everybody as a result kind of wins. So you know, that 30% on-site rate versus 80% on-site rate, you know, again, please reach out to Raymond and I if you want us to model some type of scenario that's more pertinent to something that you're either A, is in your pipeline, or B, is currently ongoing, and these metrics don't kind of align and you're not really sure how the cost savings would materialize for your situation, we would love to have the opportunity to show you and demonstrate what's pertinent to you. Again, we kind of took these numbers on the previous slide and this slide, normalized it against a lot of different data points and kind of came up with a scenario. It was a completely hypothetical scenario, and the audience will have access to this slide deck after the presentation, in addition to the case study that Justin Rudolph and myself wrote on behalf of Creo, so that you can kind of understand where the cost savings are. But it's not just cost, it's also the retention on the site level, the retention at the CRO level, and as a result of retention on both ends, sponsors are very happy when resources who are initially allocated to a study remain on the study, because a lot of those delays and learning curves as a result of certain turnover and attrition and getting a new CRA up to speed and having the sites, you know, reestablish a relationship is very, very inefficient. And I constantly see in budgets now, not surprisingly, where sites are charging for CRA change fees because it's such a problem. So I just want, you know, everybody to be aware that burnout is a big result of this. And so Creo can certainly help with that as well.
Great. We can flip through the next page, and I see some really good questions piling up. So I think we'll talk through this quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but suffice to say, I think a lot of people focus on the technology line item, and we purposely set the software license, which is line 2. We just made them the exact same as between Creo and whatever other EDC vendor is out there, and who knows, it could be more, could be less, whatever. But the point is, look at the holistic costs, right? Because if the technology changes workflows, there's going to be, it's going to ripple through a lot of different line items. For instance, the design fees could be lower cost if you had, you know, a system that had very, you know, easy to use, reusable templates, and the build could be done faster and easier. Then that should be reflected in a lower design fee. That's an example. Just want to hone in on one item there: data lock, delivery, and archiving fee. That's kind of my favorite. So Robert, what is it? What is a data lock, delivery, and archiving fee?
Yeah, so you know, it's kind of that last push to have all your clinical data coordinators issuing queries, chasing down PIs for their signature, you know, cleaning the database. But along with just locking a database, there's a lot of documentation that's required. So database lock documentation, database archiving, and actually delivering the database to the sponsor for the sake of being able to extract the data from an earlier slide so that the statisticians can do what they have to do in terms of an analysis, ultimately leading to a clinical study report known as a CSR. So, you know, there's always that line item that kind of encompasses all those tasks that I just mentioned that kind of, you know, says, okay, we're going to lock the database. We're going to put the documentation of how we locked it, when we locked it, who locked it. We got all of our signatures, and then of course archiving the database in the event that a regulatory agency wants to see something within that database: audit trails, reasons for changes, you know, timestamps, user accesses, what pages were clicked, what pages weren't clicked. The whole navigation in any EDC platform can be tracked. We can tell what pages were clicked on, which ones were not clicked on, how long the page was viewed for. there's all these metrics that are captured. So kind of all of that is encompassed in this data lock delivery and archiving fee. So the beauty about Creo, and before, because I want to get past this slide, is that think of this as a lock as you go feature. Just like in clinical healthcare, many of you who went to your primary care physician or a specialist, you receive some sort of after visit summary of what your visit was, what your vitals were, any changes to your medications, any new medications, what was done to you during that visit. The physician or providers report on your current status, and they sign off on that right there and then. They don't just type this up and sign off on it later. Similarly here, there needs to be a parallel. We actually need to close the gap between research and clinical medicine because they're kind of, one and the same if you really think about it. So with Creo, the PIs or the providers who are delegated to do so are signing off on the visits that are being conducted in real time. I know the question you're saying is, well, what about if there's a query during that visit? That's fine. After you query a certain point within that visit, it breaks that signature, and this PI or provider delegated person would go back in and just re-sign that CRF. So at the end of the day, what we don't do is we're not having to reach out to sites and say, okay, database lock is 8 weeks away, and you're talking to your CRAs and you're talking to the PMs and you're talking to your sites. Are all PIs going to be available on this date for signature? And if not, please let us know. And of course, everybody's had this experience. You come to that database lock time point, and there's a handful, dozens of PIs who haven't signed off on the database yet. The pages are locked, everything's clean, there's no outstanding queries, we're just pending a signature. So that effort is very laborious, it's very inefficient, and enabling a rolling lock as you go workflow enables you to kind of streamline that process and not miss that deadline, because I've been part of many, many studies where we've had one PI who happened to be on a plane on their way to Europe, and we just could not get a hold of the PI, and we missed the database lock because one site impacts all sites. So just wanted to kind of highlight that point, but I think we can move on to the next slide and kind of articulate some other points here.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this throughout, but this isn't obviously just cost, but it's data quality, it's faster data lock, freeing site time up to focus more on patients, it's patient safety through all the edit checks up front, reducing site startup time because you're not waiting for coordinators to build the source, and really about empowering the sites and enabling them to focus on the study itself. And just to amplify Robert's point about the data lock, keep in mind, PIs, they will live in eSource. This will be their system. This is what they use. And so ask them to sign off on a visit. Guess what? In Source, they already do that. So all we're doing by asking them to sign off on the visit is just, making electronic a workflow that already exists. So if they're already used to signing it off on eSource, why not make that the EDC sign off? Because the problem with the EDC sign off at the end of the study is the PI's never logged in. We all know that, right? PI has a username and password somewhere saved, and so we all know it's a huge barrier and obstacle and a huge effort to get the PI to log in. And then they log in, they do the bulk signature. We all know they aren't looking at it, but they are looking at the source. They live in the source. So you're getting contemporaneous signatures on a frequent basis from PIs who are actually engaging on the material. So it's actually a meaningful signature. So this model dispenses that whole data lock, exercise that consumes weeks and weeks of time for which you're paying, by the way, as a sponsor. So
right. How many times have we as CRAs been on site and the coordinator comes back and says, oh, sorry, that document's in the PI's mailbox for signature? That happens all the time, or it's missing from the patient source. So yeah, to Raymond's point, that kind of eliminates everything, and it really enables and empowers sites to take control of their deliverables and really ease that burden if it's used efficiently and effectively. All right, we can move on to the next slide.
You can probably just go into the Q&A. Oh yes, one last question here, and
yes,
this is one of the questions here. But as Robert mentioned, I think you said half of your sites were Creo sites, and they weren't selected for Creo. It wasn't even a consideration. The site selection just organically right. Happened to be a lot of Creo sites. So could you have staffed your entire site with Creo trial with Creo sites if you wanted to? Yes. Could you have made Creo a requirement for non-Creo sites and got them up and running? Yeah, if they agreed to it. But just to give you some context, Pfizer and Moderna, the vaccine trials, if you those, not necessarily at the time, but if you have those trials today and you go on ct.gov, because it's public information, we did the count, about a third of them are CREO clients. So well, we don't actually know how much each site enrolled, but if they just enrolled at the average in the US, we're talking 20,000 patients enrolled just on the CREO sites within those two studies. And certainly there's many others that aren't represented. So there's a lot of throughput capacity right now with
Exactly.
sites that are already up and running.
And I'd like to say, and this is a completely, I'm not saying this, it's not a matter of if you're going to encounter a CREO site, it's really when you're going to encounter a CREO site. So I personally believe as an outsider who's not employed by CREO, that this is the future, this is the efficiencies that this industry needs. Just like it was a hard push to convert our 3 carbon copy paper CRFs to an eCRF, this is going to be the new futures. And so we really look forward to welcoming discussions. Raymond and I are available to engage with any of the stakeholders who have any specific questions that we can't get to online today. But please do reach out to us. We'd love to have conversations with you and explain the CREO model in very, very good detail for you.
Yeah, and I think we can go into audience Q&A because we have about 8 minutes left, and I know, Ryan, you sent us this. So this is a good slide here because I think this will actually address 2 separate questions. One question is who builds and validates a source, the template. So who builds it can be, CREO can build it, it's a service we do, or someone who's experienced and knows how to build the template can do it. And how is it validated? It's done how you normally validate, I think, an eCRF build, right? Like someone has to just, the sponsor, who's the end user, will review it and probably stress test it, I assume, with dummy data. All of that's exactly the same process. And then there's another question related to this slide, which is who owns a database and who archives the data. So this is our architecture. So the publisher is where the study template is built. Then the study template is pushed to the sites, and the sites collect data in eSource. The sponsor has no access to the eSource. That's a site's database. PHI exists there, and there are workflows that are like designed for the sites to collect data. So one of the things that sites do, they might have a concept of a draft progress note. Like Robert said, progress notes are very important. Well, maybe there's a sub-I who write a detailed thoughtful progress note. Well, I'm not the PI. I just want the PI to take a look, see if he or she agrees. I'll make a draft progress note and then ping the PI, and the PI can come in there and say, yeah, I agree, and then they can publish it from there. So we have this concept of a remote collaborative workflow for the sites, and then when it's published by the site, then it gets sent into review, which is what the CRO or sponsor can use to interrogate and review the data. So who owns the data? Here's the answer, both, because the site owns their data in eSource and the sponsor owns the data in reviewer. Dual ownership, it is a dual database. That's huge because you don't have this idea that, like, if this were a sponsor system, the sponsor ultimately controls the database, right? And I think it's fanciful. I don't think any sponsor can go in there and manipulate the data, but like that is theoretically possible, but it's actually impossible in our system because the sponsor cannot access the site's eSource data. That eSource data is always the site's data, and they will always have access to it. So at the end of the study, we keep the site's instance alive, and they can go and retrieve the source anytime. We don't, have to burn the data onto a CD and mail it to them. That whole thing goes away, which is part of that delivery fee we talked about. So that was one of the questions. There's a question here. I'm not sure I totally understand this, Robert, but can you speak a bit to the age-old belief that by having eSource built to directly harmonize with eCRF, then standard of care medical workup of a patient will suffer? I have not heard that. Question 3.
Question 3. So that having eSource built directly to harmonize with the eCRF, that standard of care medical workup with, I'm not sure I understand the question. I don't see how it would create the standard of care medical workup of a patient. Standard of care is standard of care. So if standard of care is incorporated into a protocol, let's just say physical examination, I mean, I'm not seeing how the patient would suffer as a result of having a pre-built source document that allows, you know,
I think you went on mute. Yeah. Robert, you're on mute, I think.
I think we just lost his audio.
Okay.
For a
But
moment.
one, I think to clarify a little bit is, okay, how would you write a template using this model? We would actually write it more like source than eCRF. In other words, eCRF is often abbreviated, derivative, conclusions. We would actually write the source with more detail. That's much more around all the different intermediate steps the site has to do for a couple of reasons. One, it's workflow friendly. It guides the site, it standardizes it. Two, it eliminates protocol deviations. So the source data templates that we recommend, the way you'd write it, would have more data points, more fields than your typical eCRF. Well, we don't have a pricing model based on the number of data points, right? What we really want to do is let's just nail the protocol compliance. And in the process of collecting the data and filling out the templates, you're getting the endpoint data that you need for the analysis, but you have the confidence that it was collected the right way. So keep in mind, again, this all gets extracted into a file, gets uploaded, dealt with by the statistician. If the statistician has 10 columns and 2 of them are the endpoint data that goes into the analysis, as most statisticians can figure out that I can exclude 8 columns. I mean, this is not a disqualifying event that there are some data points that may not ultimately make the CSR page, but are necessary to ensure that the methodology was there for the endpoint data. That's a positive. So I would not worry about how much data is in there. I worry about getting the compliance down right, getting it to the point where you're really dummy proofing the data collection, and then you've got the key data that you need, and just work with that. Thanks, Ryan. You gave us the other 2 questions. One is, has your system been used in international studies? And I think there was a comment that some countries don't allow remote monitoring. I don't know if that's true or not. I hear sometimes some countries say that their regulators don't allow electronic data, but people usually say something's not allowed for regulatory reasons, and it's usually just made up. Like, usually you have to say, okay, well, where are you hearing this from? And it's a lot of times just anecdote and word of mouth. I don't think that's true. Remote monitoring is not allowed. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, ePro is now global, right? So patients are collecting source data on patient-reported outcomes on their phones, and these are all global, right, in different languages, and they all get sent in, and they do get reviewed. There's some level of interrogation. So I think that's not true. But there was a related question, which probably is true. As a former CRC at a large healthcare system, we had institutional pushback against using a direct data entry, where paper source only, and new systems required a lengthy institutional validation process. So I guess the subtext is, how would this, would we be excluded from this model? And I think there's 2 ways that a site could use this. One is if the sponsor says, hey, this is a condition of using the trial, and it's on our license. That's actually different than your healthcare institution licensing directly from CREO. So the former might not be that different than the sponsor saying use this EDC or use this EPRO, which your IT department will not protest. Also keep in mind that the private information is in your eSource instance is not accessible by the sponsor, right? So there's built-in PHI protection because of the architecture. But above and beyond that, yes, there are definitely still some sites that prefer paper, period. And I don't know why. I have absolutely no, I'm completely flabbergasted. I don't know why, you would why if I wanted to do banking and the bank said, sorry, we just philosophically against online banking, we like the old school way, we have to write the deposit check and come and direct I'd be like, I'm not going to go to you as a bank. So as a sponsor, you have the right to pick the sites on your trial. I'm not sure why it's normalized that you would pick a site that is opposed to technology. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know about you, Robert, but what's your take? Oh, you're still on mute.
Unfortunately, I think we may have lost his audio.
But I think we're right. Oh, can sites customize the visit procedure source around the fixed source template to accommodate their own SCPs? Yes. So the central template is uniform. sites can add on top of that if they want. So they have their own procedure. They could add a pre-screening visit that's not even part of the study. They could even add that if they wanted to. So there is that customization above and beyond the central template in this feature. And we might be at time.
At the last of the questions that we probably have time for today. I think perhaps at this point we can just wrap up and thank the audience for their questions. Let them know, of course, that if we couldn't attend to all the questions, the team at CREO will follow up with you. Or if you have some further questions, I have contact information up on the screen that people can reach out to. I also want to direct the audience's attention towards the handouts module within the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. I want to thank all of the audience for participating and let them know that you'll be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. Also, a survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Additionally, I've shared a link to view the recording of today's event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues so that they may register for the recording here as well. For those watching via LinkedIn Live events, we do encourage you to visit xtalks.com to register for this event and gain access to features such as viewing the recording and more. Now, please join me, everyone, in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.